Welcome, listeners, to Through the Sightglass, the podcast that dives deep into the fascinating world of craft beer and celebrates the incredible individuals who shape its vibrant landscape. Join us on a journey where we explore the nuances of this amazing industry and the remarkable people who contribute to its richness and diversity. Welcome, Chris Clarke. Hailing from the vibrant town of Harlingen, Texas, and armed with a bachelor's in fine arts and studio art and design, coupled with a minor in Spanish, Chris is a true maestro with a heart as rich as his Costa Rican roots. After his college studies at the University of North Texas, Chris found his way to the sunny streets of Oakland, California, where through a bit of luck and fate, he met a friend named Joe, an avid home brewer himself who further fed the fire and passion that Chris had developed for this liquid alchemy that was craft beer. Once he was settled in Oakland, Chris launched himself into the education, practice, and honing of this new form of art. He wasted no time in working with some of the finest of the craft beer scene in California, with such notables such as Anchor Brewing Company, to the cozy corners of Local Brewing Company, and the traditional German bar of Brotzeit Local. Chris immersed himself deeper into the love, craft, and pure passion that flows in every drop of craft beer. At the same time, Chris avidly worked to become a level 2 Cicerone, truly showing his dedication and education to the art and history of it. But the story doesn't end there. With the encouragement from a friend and a burst of momentum, Chris took his talents to Tacoma, where he continued to weave his magic at such places as Seven Seas Brewing, earning accolades for his barrel-aged beer, as well as Tin Dog Brewing, a Belgian-style brewery located just south of Seattle. More than a decade of heart, passion, and soul poured into the liquid artistry that is beer. We're stoked and excited to have Chris share his wealth of knowledge, experiences, and stories. So without further ado, let's raise a glass and welcome Chris Clarke to the Through the Sightglass podcast. Buddy, thanks for coming on.
Sweet. Thanks for having me, you guys.
Yeah.
Excited to be here.
Well, we appreciate it. Appreciate people to learn about you. And so kind of like we talked about before, we usually start off with, kind of like where you grew up, how you grew up, family dynamics. You can talk about as little or as much as you want. So just kind of like where you grew up and how that was for you.
Perfect. So we'll talk about the barrios of Harlingen and McAllen, Texas. I grew up in the Rio Grande Valley. It's a border community, if you know, RGV 956 represent. Border town. My dad worked for the Maquiladoras, and my mother being Costa Rican. I'm first generation American, so my mom is Costa Rican. My dad's actually from Panama. So it was a really great place for the family to kind of grow and develop and have some new immigrants kind of be in a community of immigrants, so to speak. So we fashioned ourselves kind of the same as everyone else in that community. It was just kind of, a lot of brown folks, a lot of Mexican Americans, Chicanos. And in Harlingen specifically, it was a very kind of snowbird community. So a lot of folks that would come down from the upper states of, like, say, Michigan, Wisconsin, everywhere from, like, Colorado, just trickled their way down and found themselves in a nice kind of warm tropical community for about half of the year. So
Gotcha.
That's kind of how we landed there. My grandparents, my dad's side of the family, was all in kind of Virginia, pretty cold out there in Western Virginia, and found themselves kind of retiring, so to speak, or snowbirding down to the Rio Grande Valley. So when my folks got together and decided they wanted to move to the United States and get married, they moved to Texas and had opportunity down south, and were able to move us right smack dab across the street from my grandparents. So
nice.
I grew up out there, and kind of fast forward everything. I had, me and my two younger sisters grew up in that same community and kind of outgrew South Texas, and though had a lot of opportunities and was exposed to a lot of really great musical scenes and culture, and a lot of what is my tech or engineering background through the magnet school I went to. Ended up graduating, moving my way up to North Texas, and moved to the Bible Belt, where I went to University of North Texas and studied art and met a bunch of people that were bohemian and kind of very expressive in many ways. And that's where I kind of dove pretty deep into beer. And I think that's kind of where I would have the story begin.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay. I guess I'll just ask. I mean, I've known you for a while, but growing up, I think in like a very tight knit community with not only family, but I feel people there feel very similar to you. Like for me, where I grew up, um, poor redneck area. I feel like rednecks don't really have a bond. They just kind of like take care of themselves, but you're just next door to each other. Did that play a role in like your interest in like arts, in your interest in creating, and like your diversity, and I mean not just like physical forms of art, but like music and things like that?
Yeah, I think a lot of things. So interestingly enough, I mean, the Rio Grande Valley itself is a very eclectic, very unique, culturally vast area. And to give you guys perspective of the Rio Grande Valley, if you were to look at a map and look at the southernmost tip of Texas, that's exactly where it is. Right on the river is the way we kind of look at it. So you have people from all sorts of different communities that are all kind of melding together and sticking together. It was a really kind of progressive thing to be a part of. Now that I've seen the world from more of a macro lens, I think moving to the Bible Belt, I definitely saw more of. You go to a school like University of North Texas. There's 40,000 people there from all over the state, and then you start to see people from like podunk towns in what is arguably the biggest state in the country and the most red state in the country. So where we lived, it was rather progressive. I mean, people held a lot of really particular ideals close to their chests and were very family oriented. But a lot of what came into creativity for me, sharing those experiences with obviously that community, but also the parallel of being Costa Rican, spending a lot of time in Costa Rica and spending pretty much every other summer, 3 months out of every other year, going to school or just being immersed in that community as a parallel brought a lot of creative perspective. And so it was there that I got really immersed into the metal community. It was there that I got really immersed into a lot of elements of design and art and painting and illustration and just kind of more of a vibrant lifestyle,
Mm-hmm.
I guess. Not to say that living in South Texas wasn't already pretty vibrant, but I think that kind of set the foreground for a lot of really interesting things about myself that kind of invited a lot of the community, but more importantly, just painted a unique picture about myself that was kind of something that I always kind of, I guess for the most part, still wear on my sleeve. It's still part of my identity, and it's still part of like who I am. I think, being Costa Rican, being Panamanian, having that like, multiracial background has always been a big part of a lot of that. So I think that that played a lot into what got me into elements of, I think, design or elements of, I think, of like creativity and having my hands in it. I mean, from making tamales and cooking and all the things that are part of like that ethnic background, I guess, played important roles into the, I guess, like my drive or passion for things. And so that's how craft beer kind of played into it. It was like, I worked in school my entire time when I was in college, and I worked with craft beer. And I think a lot of it was very new and fresh, probably around 2008, 2009. I remember drinking, my very first Racer 5 at a place called Midway Mart. And if anyone's listening from that area, I mean, you probably know that that's probably a mecca for craft beer in Denton, Texas, and still exists today, and started as a gasoline station with a few craft beer shops. And now you can go get growler fills and have some of the most fancy, sexy beers that are probably out there in that part of the world. But just cutting your teeth on stuff like that you don't know are going to blow up to become something else. And, you just start caring about things a little differently. And I think, that was kind of my introduction to craft beer and being in art school and being in that Dentonite community, I think played a big role, in addition to my background and ethnical background, as well.
Yeah.
So,
Well, I think what I've really noticed from knowing you for a while is that It's not just like values, but like representing where you're from is there's not, it's not just like importance behind it, but there is identity associated with it. And that's very unique. I think that's something that can really separate businesses and just, people into just getting not whitewashed, but you're just stuck in a large group. Like you just get grouped into like, oh, your brewers or your business owners, having some of those unique, I think, characteristics or identifiers for what you represent and who you are makes you different to most of the world. And I think that's something that more, I wouldn't say more people should be proud of, but yeah, I think that's great to have. And I also say too, like in the state of Texas, there's already such a big German beer influence. I think it's awesome that like your first like cutting your teeth is a beer from out of Beer Republic is out of California, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah,
like Racer 5
in Healdsburg. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I think that's awesome because just from like people on the West Coast, the stuff that you get used to and you grew up around, sometimes people get jump started on something that is totally not from where you're from, and those people might ask you, it's like, well, why didn't you drink what was around you? Because it was just as great. So I also think that's awesome and kind of like ironic. I think it happens a lot of places.
Oh yeah, I mean you can. My dad's a Jack and Coke kind of guy, so like you got whiskey's obviously huge in the state of Texas, and so we didn't grow up with beer around the house. I mean, so to speak, like as a teenager going into beer was something that was just kind of around, and I was fortunate enough to have that kind of cool dad around. He would let the friends kind of hang out and have beers at the house. When we were in high school, as long as everyone just kind of stayed, and you had parents that were kind of like that. I just wasn't really interested in drinking beer at the time. But yeah. I think, things like, Miller and Shiner and Ziegenbach, all those things were kind of laid around. And then you have something, at least for me, like, drinking something like a Racer 5, that's just going to kind of kick you in the ass, and have something that's just going to leave a half-hour long lingering, flavor profile in the back of your mouth is just something that I thought was kind of unique, and I didn't think beer could do. Yeah.
What was beer that your dad or your parents would let you guys like drink or taste or whatnot when you were hanging out with you and your friends?
Yeah, I think a lot of it was probably Miller and Shinerbach. Shiner is an interesting story and probably left for a whole different other time, but the Sputzel Brewery has, for all intents and purposes, been creating what I would envision was like the roots of craft beer in Texas for a lot of reasons. Just, if for nothing else, creating old world beers and throwing back recipes to something that, now is probably regular to see on a shelf, but at the time, people weren't necessarily all that familiar with some of those styles. So it was kind of a indirect influence and definitely a cultural influence of sorts, but I think for a lot of people that would be the craft beer that most people have had. A Bach beer, for most people is something.
Yeah, people don't like in Texas.
Yeah, they even, I mean, I think a lot of people are like, oh yeah, like that's, for now, like if you drink a Shiner, it's thrown amongst the group of light American lagers and things of that nature. But back then, I think that beer was something special to drink. I mean, they started pumping out, like, I used to love drinking their Hefeweizen. The Ruby Redbird's obviously a really refreshing radler. People drink all the time in Texas because it's just hot as balls. But you have like all these unique different styles that they would kind of kick out in specialty packs. Their Christmas beer, their take on, what I remember at the time as being like the Christmas ale from Anchor, and all these unique different.
Cheer. Oh, the Christmas.
The cheer, yeah. And so,
sorry, Christmas ale from Anchor.
Yeah, they have some really unique kind of different beers that they kind of threw in the mix, with their bread and butter being, the Shinerbach. So I think that was something that was kind of a household name for most people, in addition to Miller Lite. And I don't know why this is the case, but I still think, I mean, even Lone Star, you could talk all you want about Lone Star, but I think most people, even in rural areas, are still drinking more Miller than Lone Star. I think Lone Star got a little bit of a popularity pop, I think, in a lot of college communities, definitely in the Austin area with UT and you could see aspects of that in Denton, but I would say that still Miller was kind of like the common person's beer, and I still think Miller Lite, Miller High Life, things of that nature were things that you just saw pretty regularly everywhere you went. With Boilermakers, things like that, you shoot a shot of Jim Beam, you have a Miller Lite. I mean, it was kind of the beer that I think most people just kind of associated with drinking beer.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
It's definitely something we saw whenever we've spent time in Texas and Oklahoma. I mean, we saw Shiner and Lone Star. Definitely things that we've drank when we've been in the South.
Oh, yeah. Well, and like, I definitely agree that you have, I mean, so growing up in the Northwest, you know, of course, you have Coors Light, Bud Light, you have Miller out here. People always drink Rainier or Olympia. And it was just called like Olympia beer, and their tagline was like, it's in the water. And that beer definitely always tasted different than the other sort of like macro light beers. But yeah, everybody had the option to drink like Miller High Life or whatnot, but it's always Rainier, you know, Rolling Rock or Olympia beer. So I do that's a good point. I think that's like always super interesting to see kind of, you can live in a state. I mean, growing up in Washington State, we're the state of hops, and yet, you know, your early drinking is surrounded by these kind of bigger macros that are like twinged somewhat as craft. And so, yeah, I do know that when we went to Dallas and stuff, probably the first times I went to Texas, it was all about Shiner Bock and like Michelob Ultra. It was a lot of what people drank, and it wasn't until later, I think, when I came back and we all worked with a mutual friend, Mark Montez, but he was like, you need to drink a Lone Star. I'd never heard of a Lone Star, never drank a Lone Star, and they do the puzzles on the caps, just like Rainier used to do with their bottles, and that's what everybody used to drink around here. So I was like, oh, okay, yeah, I can understand this now.
Yeah. I think Rachel said it in the other podcast. It's the grocery store beers, the ones that you just grab at the grocery store.
Kind of like consistent what you list.
Yeah. All right. I mean, I don't know. Growing up in South Texas, it was like, you know, it's kind of, you had like your little cliques, but I think for the most part, everyone was just from the valley. You know, you didn't have like, you know, your little crowd, or like there wasn't much defining like different sex or demographics. I mean, and there was like these small group of like what you might look at like as like hipsters from the outside in, but I think that's like where a lot of like these beers tend to make their way into, like Lone Star or Rainier or things like that. And as things like, you moved up further up into Texas and like went to schools like Denton or UT, or even if you're at A&M, like I think for the most part, you still saw like things like Lone Star kind of being popular in like music venues, or like certain types of like little bars that kind of pander to that demographic of people. But for the most part, like the people's beer was just like whatever was available. Whatever was on tap, man.
Yeah, true. Yeah. And if it was refreshing, because state of Texas gets hot. Yeah, it goes through its seasons. So I know you said something that really stood out to you was like Racer 5, but considering that you have a bachelor in fine arts, so you hung out with, I would say, from metalheads to artists. Were you exposed to? Was there like a beer, if it wasn't Racer 5, if that's the one that sticks in your memory, perfect. That's where it kind of launched you. But do you have like another memory of something that was just like, oh man, like what is this? I want to learn more about it.
Steel Reserve.
Steel Reserve?
Steel Reserve, man. That's what the metalheads were drinking. We had band practice and we were broke. It was Steel Reserve or a Miller High Life 32-ounce can.
Yeah, that's violent.
that
fits the need.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it was just like getting there fast. I remember playing with a group of guys in Denton, and we were like, man, wouldn't it be cool if we were sponsored by like Steel Reserve, and we had like a van with like a Steel Reserve,
like cooler,
kind of like just like a wrapped Steel Reserve van. And so yeah, we drank malt liquor. I mean, we were drinking in Denton. I think a lot of what kind of like sparked me, and like we're like, oh cool. Well, the big question for me, if I look back, is like, where'd you go from not drinking at all to like drinking almost in abusive excess? It was like moving up to the Bible Belt. I mean, I think even in a moist county like Denton at the time, you know, drinking was just such a huge part of community and a big part of everything. And I was a pothead for all intents and purposes. So moving into that area, also you see the laws of marijuana really crack down significantly. So
yeah,
it was like,
it's not
cool,
okay to do that, but
there's no more
being drunk is fine.
Yeah, there's no more, hey, we're just hanging out, smoking pot, maybe listening to a record. It's like, oh no, dude, we're gonna pound some steel reserves and we're gonna write the music that we're gonna put out. And like, so it was just kind of a big change and a lot of adaptation. I mean, I think there's a lot to be said about that aspect of alcohol, but I think from the lens in which I worked, I think, you know, what really drew me into craft beer was really more kind of being in that community, working in restaurants, working in these spaces and with people that are just pounding brews and taking shots. And then looking at something like Old Rasputin coming in and like something like Racer or like, you know, Sierra Nevada Pale Ale coming in on the shelf. And you're just like, oh yeah, like how do we market and sell this to someone who, you know, really just wants a shot and a beer? It's like, oh cool, well guess what? Like if you drink 3 Old Rasputins, it's not gonna. You don't need to take that shot anymore. You're gonna be feeling great because this is a 10%.
True.
You know,
absolutely
sour
true.
or what have you. So it's kind of interesting. People at that time, I think, were especially with like breweries like Rar and Sons up in the Dallas Fort Worth area, and then you had like I remember the UFO and a couple different places that people used to frequent for what their craft beer needs were at that time. I think we're looking for big old beers that were just gonna kick in the ass.
I do like that train of thought because I've definitely met people where they're like, I want to quit drinking like hard alcohol. So then they just start having higher percentage, you know, sort of like local beers or even just beers in general. And that is like the trade-off. But that is a good point because there's probably plenty of times where it's like you're having light beer and you may want something stronger, but you don't necessarily need a shot. But in your brain does this math of, I can do a shot in another light beer. Or the other side of the math is like, well, what is there like 8% and above that I could drink that might not be as gnarly as if. And that's just coming from not only my own experience, but working in this industry and seeing plenty of people do that math out loud.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So, Racer 5 got you in, like, I would say that seems to be a big point of looking at that this doesn't have to be malt liquor. It's like, oh, there's like interesting nuances and compounds in this that I want to explore.
Oh yeah, it was Racer 5 or we'd get like Baltica number 9. You know, and that was like one of the first times like
that Baltic Porter.
Yeah, I remember Midway Mart just had, you know, these beers and we're just like, what the hell is that? So it's kind of like what money did you have in your pocket? And like what could you spend your money on? So like they'd do single bottles and you'd be able to pick something up or do a mix and match. And Racer 5 was always good for that aspect. It just felt like the hops were just kicking you in the face, and that was like unique.
Especially in such a malt-driven state with all the beers.
Yeah, or like you're drinking something light, and you'd be like, and honestly, like a Racer 5 6er would last us somewhere around like, man, I could drink maybe 20 Modelo's, but then if I had that Racer 5 6-pack would last me the entire night because you'd just be it'd be a hard beer to just take down like that at that time. So it'd just be like a sipper, like you're like, oh man, you're drinking Racer 5, that's intense, you know. But everything else would just be like, you know, cool, yeah.
Just pump.
Why not have 20 of these like Keystone Lights or whatever? But
I kind of do miss those days of like early on in craft beer when I wasn't so used to all like the hops and the bitterness, because I do remember drinking beers where it was like, oh man, like this is heavy. It wasn't heavy in alcohol. It was just you were processing a lot, and so you weren't chugging it. And the more that you do drinking, R&D, research, all these things, you get so used to it, and then you're just like, oh yeah, I've identified these flavors and these aromas, and then you can just slug it down and on to the next one. So that is kind of I guess like a period in time that I missed. So it probably would help my wallet right now, not being able to just pound 3 or 4 beers where it's like, oh, I enjoyed these hops, but I can get past them so quickly because I just log them, put them away, and then it just all starts to taste similar. But yeah, so Racer 5, based out of California, and you eventually moved to California. You moved to Oakland, California, out of college. What was that experience like? We know some of the mutual people. When I met you later on, I got to meet some of the people that you moved to Oakland with, which was fun. fun in getting to know that backstory. So
yeah, no, yeah, I always had a dream that I'd move to California. I think a lot of people grow up with that, especially in Texas. Mm-hmm. It's a beautiful state, and Oakland, being a metalhead, I mean, Bay Area thrash. I mean, the story goes on and on. We could have an entire 4-hour podcast about the metal scene in Oakland, and growing up in Texas and loving football, and knowing that the Raiders were from Oakland, and like that big bad nasty team. And
did Raiders start for you in Texas? Were you a Raiders fan in Texas?
I always had the silver and black was always that mystique, that allure to the Raiders was always there. And then listening to music, you listen to these bands and you see like, oh man, that guy's got a Raider shield on his shirt. He's got that Raider cap on, and you're always like, yeah, gotcha. Those guys are badasses. And then you watch, watching people like Stabler, even in my I guess formative years, like watching someone like Rich Gannon like throw the ball, seeing them go up and play against the Patriots, Tuck Rule. I mean, we can go into all this stuff. I mean, the Raiders were definitely a mystique team that was just like, yeah, that's a fucking badass team. And then you learn about the history, and growing up in Texas, we all football was huge in my house. My family's all Cowboys fans, and I always found ways to root against my dad, and he's also a Lakers fan. I hate the Lakers. So there's always there was that I grew up with, and everyone was a Spurs fan when I grew up, so I had to go against them. And I was a Mavs fan, and so it was just kind of different things to just.
You kind of always want to play the role.
Always want to play
the
antagonist. Yeah. Always the dark side, man. That's the That's good. So moving to Oakland was just like a dream come true for me, and I think a lot of the art. Just beyond that, the artistic world, and a lot of things that were happening around 2008 and through 2011 were always like, oh man, look what they're doing in Oakland. And I knew people that had moved there. And so when I had the opportunity to move there, right out of college, the ending of 2010 into 2011, it was really cool. So yeah, I got to kind of immerse myself in all those communities firsthand. So it was awesome. Yeah.
So was the main reason for you moving there, was it for work? That was regarding, I know you did marketing for a little bit for companies, so I guess trying to tie and understand.
It was absolutely not for work. I had zero job.
Oh, okay, gotcha. So
I was not for craft beer.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was just a change. I was dating someone who moved out there, and I was like, oh, cool, we can give this a shot. And I went out there and tried it out, and I knew that I was pretty thrilled to be in that area and have a lot of things I wanted to do musically and artistically there. And I thought I would probably just get another industry job in craft beer or bartending or something of that nature. And actually did not. Struggled very much trying to find something in that realm of things. And so that's when tech and its big boom was happening. And so I had skills that lent themselves to kind of marketing. And I had some sales background, so I was able to go into tech and work for a startup, and we ended up being an account executive for a marketing firm, worked with SEO, website optimization, a lot of crap that at the time I was like, I want nothing to do with this stuff.
And now it's super vital. Now is the future.
Well, yeah, now, here we are now. So at the time, lending that was great because I needed money, and everyone kind of, the reason I left was because of how expensive the Bay Area is. But I think a lot of what I experienced at that time was a lot of financial destitution. I was around a lot of people that were trying to do good and work for nonprofits and just kind of follow their dreams, and were really crushed by how expensive it was to live out there. So working in tech, it allowed me the ability to at least get my nice good foothold on being able to live, get a place to rent, etc. And then from there I was able to rent out a studio and work on my art, and was able to meet some people and start writing music out there. And through tech I actually, ironically enough, found my way back into craft beer. Was working with some accounts. I know like the Torpedo Room had been, someone I had been working with, Sierra Nevada had just started opening up their first pilot tap room where they were going to showcase a bunch of exclusive beers, and work with Trimmer Pilsner down the road, which is an Austrian brewery at the time that had like come to the United States and made home in Berkeley to provide a really beautiful Pilsner, and work with Takara Sake, which is kind of like a big, grocery store household name for sake and rice wines of that nature. And then, I ended up, just kind of immersing myself in that whole world. So it was weird. It was a lot of like just wearing different hats, and I kind of, in many ways, look at it like a Renaissance man perspective, because I was doing that, working in art, ended up helping this optician with like his glasses shop as a part-time thing. That turned into a full-time thing. That turned into me getting licensed in the state of California to be an optician, where I took...
Yeah, I never knew this about you.
Yeah.
He was telling me, and I was like, I'm sorry, what? Go back? Say that again, Chris. What?
Yes, I filled people's prescriptions, and I worked with a lot of famous people to do that, and that was part-time. In addition, also working at a couple beer bars. And living in the Bay Area is just a grind. There was probably no time, I think, for about 4 years straight where I didn't work at least 3 jobs.
I think when I envision this of what you were saying, and we've talked about this before, but like very much so, I think like an artist, I would say artist dream for sure, where you just are literally diving into everything. You're in the music scene, you're in the art scene, you're getting to know the community, but also find these places that are like niche, creative, and also somewhat vital. 2008, probably people didn't know much about sake or little about it. And I'm not just saying that from perspective. I say that from just like how the rise of natural wine, rice wines, and other beverages have gone throughout the past 10 years. That's just from 2013 to now, or 2014 to now. But, and that's just that it involves a whole lot of culture too. And I think like similar people that resonate with yourself, where not only do they represent what they love and what they want to do, but there is part of that value that is their culture and identity that I think is important when you, especially in service industry where it's collective and stuff, but a lot of the business owners, or you can even say majority of head management and just people in general, it is just fairly whitewashed. Being in the Bay Area, being involved in this very, I think, artistic and also adventurous part of your life. You found yourself working at a variety of different places, like you said, typically working 3 jobs at a time for a period of 4 years or more. How'd you find yourself getting into and working in craft beer? Because you worked at, we offered up in the intro, but tell us a little bit of your time at local brewing, at Anchor Brewing, and then Brotzeit Local.
Yeah, so I'm trying to like piecemeal this whole like timeline together. So it all kind of happened. It's just becoming like a yes man, I guess, is the way I kind of look at it. So I finally kicked myself out of tech, and I was like, yep, this is not working for me. I was like, if I need to ever sit at a desk for this amount of hours, I can do this when I'm in my 40s. So I was like, I'll revisit this some other time.
Now it's fast approaching.
Now, like, there are some things that I'd like to get done in life here. And so I just hyper-focused into art and all this. I think at that time, I was probably, even while I was working in tech, I think I picked up part-time work to work at, like, a art supply store because I wanted to have hands-on with a lot of, like, the art community because I was starting to feel like I was losing touch with them. And so I was working 40 hours a week, maybe more, because at this point I was still doing some sales stuff and working weekends over at this like Blake Art Supply store, and just working retail and trying to get to know people. And so, I think that's one of the things I do love about like retail and service of any kind is that you have an immediate step into like what is the community. And so I was like, man, I don't know anyone out here. I have no friends. So that's where I started building a rapport and building community and started meeting people to write music with and people create art with and to talk about art with. And so that was really vital for me sticking around. But after kicking myself out of tech, I ended up meeting a guy who ended up working under me for a little bit, and he got a job working at a German beer garden, and I always loved German beer. And so I started frequenting that place and got a job working there as well as a bartender. And so that world was explosive to me and pretty pivotal in me being able to really start to understand not only like beer styles and where they come from and how they influence, but how they played into the market in the United States, and unique things about like beer that were really beyond my train of thought at that time, where I could start seeing like, wow, these beers pair phenomenally with different foods and you can cook with them, and starting to understand culinary concepts that for me at the time were completely new. Even when I worked for like Chef Tim Love in Texas, like we worked with beer and a lot of cocktails and mixology around like menu items and food, and I had some of that experience. I think coming to work at Broadside was just really pivotal in that regard, because I was working with not only German beer, but I was working with Belgian beer. And then I started to, get to understand a lot of the people who were coming in and selling it at that time. And I think
you got to get those contacts as well and get to know those people.
Yeah, a lot of those contacts, a lot of like the people would come straight off the boat, and we had a very traditional kind of experience there off Embarcadero in Oakland. Not the Embarcadero in San Francisco, mind you. This was out near like Fruitvale, between Fruitvale and kind of the Jack London area. And we'd have people come out from Europe, and like Germans, and they'd bring their schnapps, or they'd be shooting back Underbergs, and we'd just be like, this was a very like cultural experience for me. And like, we sold Veltons at that time, and Veltons, we were probably one of the top accounts in the country to Veltons. Later did I find out that we were competing with like Pine Box up in Seattle at the time. And
oh wow,
it was like a big deal.
A contest? You got to go to the facility?
Yeah, there was a contest. So the account that sold the most Veltons in the fiscal year was that staff was then able to go to Germany, all expenses paid, and do like a whole beer trip for about a week. So we lost to Pine Box, at least during my tenure there. And so the owner, we'd get like second place. The owners and their family would go, and we would just get like swag and stuff. But it was really cool. We had,
gotcha.
I mean, the owner was a metalhead. Everyone who worked there was a bunch of metalheads. I mean, there's some people who work there now that are in awesome bands even to this day. So it was really cool. We did Iron Maiden like release parties.
Oh yes, like did you do the Iron Trooper beers and all the other beers that are like?
Yeah, so we worked with Artisanal, started bringing things in, which is pretty cool because here we are now, 2024, and Artisanal is now in Washington State. So like the bar I run now is now getting some love from them, and we're starting to see
that's super exciting.
Full circle. But they brought in some really sexy, Belgian beer. They brought in Fru. They brought in the other brewery, Zuner from Cologne. I mean, we were just exposed to like what I would consider some of the OG product. And even like now, since then, having gone to Europe many, many times, but like having that experience under my belt was like pivotal, because those are just some of the breweries that like you just have to kind of know. And then that's just like on the surface level. So we had a lot of exposure to that. Training staff all of a sudden like how to change like an M coupler to a G coupler, Euro Sankey, American Sankey, all on the fly while things are blowing, and all the different glassware and hand washing all of that, and it was really quite an immersive experience. And so at that time it was just a blast to be in that community with all those people. And at the time I was also working with some of those kind of tech marketing accounts, and also looking to get my optician's license, just to kind of bring up my...
Doing 30 things at once.
Just to bring up that just annual income.
Well-rounded.
Yeah. Have as many skills.
Just trying to make my nut, man. I was just trying to make my nut. Yeah.
What was your go-to beer at Broadside Local?
I was a big Belton's drinker. Again, probably slightly prompted by that contest, but I do think it's a beautiful Pilsner. I mean, I've had way better since then, but I still think it's a phenomenal go-to, and would drink it any time. But yeah, we always had Veltons. We always had the Fru Kolsch. which is still also a huge namesake. If you're ever in Cologne, that's a must go to. If you didn't go there, you probably just wasted your entire trip.
Listeners take note.
But I think that I don't know. I drink a lot of that. One of the beers. I'm not even going to answer your question, but I am looking for all our listeners out there. We would occasionally bring in Einstock, their white ale.
Oh yeah.
This was an Icelandic white ale that was being produced.
Super nice.
By a brewer who used to be brewing at Drake's out in the Bay, and then I believe they went off and started working on this project. But that beer was a clean and beautiful beer.
Sounds amazing.
I've not seen that Einstock ever since. So if anyone's listening and can, I don't know, drop it in the comments or
please
hit us up.
Yeah, email through the Sightglass. We will defer it to Chris.
Where's that Einstock at, y'all?
Yeah.
But no, we drank a lot of Veltons again. It was probably contest driven, but that was one of them. And then obviously being a metalhead, loving Maiden, drink a lot of, Robinson's, his God, what was that beer? I think it's just a straight up I think it's just a pale. The Trooper. Now he's got a few different other ones that he's pumped out.
Yeah.
But yeah, I would drink a lot of that. But yeah, I mean, like, I don't know. I can tell you some of the more interesting beers. Like, I fell in love with my very favorite beer of all time, even to this day, is like the Abbey de Saint Bonchin. Probably butchering it to some degree, but I love that sour. It's not necessarily like a Grand Cru or a Flemish red by that standards. I believe it's brewed up in the Netherlands, if I'm not mistaken. We can fact check all this stuff here later, but that was a beautiful beer, and I loved having that. We obviously always had Duchess, which is a Flemish red. That was always something unique that people had or would spit out and be like, "This tastes like fucking vinegar," and we'd have to be like, "Yo,
you don't understand.
You don't understand."
Yeah.
But yeah, having that on draft was really cool. Triple Carmelite.
Beautiful.
All the St. Bernardus. Anytime we'd get any of that in was awesome. But Triple Carmelite was always something. And I think, if I remember correctly, shout out to Nick and everyone at Artisanal here in Washington now. But I think they still do carry Triple Carmelite, which is a really nice treat to always get on draft. It was really special. People would fly out. They would drive pretty far in the Bay to come pick that up. But yeah, we'd always have like just crazy stuff on. The Belgian stuff obviously spoke to me higher volumes. I'm a huge Belgian beer drinking fan, and I'm a stickler for style guidelines. But when it comes to Belgian beer, you can do whatever the fuck you want, and I think that's how life should be. So I've always loved their beer. But yeah, I don't know. I think for beer, we drank a lot of Veltons. We drank a lot of whatever would still stay in the line, because we didn't have, fobs at that time. And so whatever would blow out, we would just fill a pitcher of whatever that may be.
Just run it through.
Yeah, Ondex, Dunkel, whatever we had, we would just pound it. And
yeah, just get it out.
Just keep it going.
That's great. Yeah, that's probably
a lot of Underberg. I mean, it's wild to think that I drank more Underberg then than I drink now, because it's just wild to conceive. But
yeah, for people that don't know, which most listeners probably do, once this podcast, we're out there and you're listening. But like Underberg is a digestif. It tastes. It's. I'm not sure. Is it derived from the licorice root?
Black licorice.
But yeah, it tastes just like black licorice, earthy, bitter. I think it's like 40% alcohol. It comes in a little shot and
tiniest little bottle neck.
Yeah. It is great though, because when you're drinking a lot of beer, you have something to help your stomach. I don't know. It might bring down your stomach pH, kind of help it not be so acidic.
It helps with your hangover anxiety. It helps with your pre-drinking anxiety. It helps with digestion of high-fat foods.
Okay.
That you will be eating while you're drinking.
It brings camaraderie to your social circle.
I like that.
Were you a marketing person for Underberg?
Oh, I loved Underberg.
Yeah.
I was always chasing the truck, Now I have friends that just give them to me, so it's
no longer as near pinnacle.
Yeah.
Well, now we just need to know that when we do podcasts, we'll start with an Underberg, because I definitely had podcast anxiety, and we're now like 30, 40 minutes in, and I finally feel like myself.
And then we'll get Underberg sponsorship.
You can also, so he's talking about the Underberg truck. You can send, it's like the cereal box prizes you used to do, send in box tops. You can send in the Underberg caps, and they'll send you different prices depending on how many caps you have. And the truck is, I think, the highest prize.
I think that,
or is
I don't
it
know
the
if it's the
Underberg
highest.
belt?
It was the one that we wanted. Now the belt, they're handing those out like candy now. I mean, everything has just changed. We'd have to relook at the catalog, but if you go on the website, you can see what you can win. And
yeah,
it's a blast. It's a blast to have an Underberg in hand.
It is interesting to see how much in the craft beer industry, I guess to me, it understands makes sense. I'm not a major metalhead. I do like metal. I do like punk rock. A lot of that sort of outcast, alienated sort of part of society. But yeah, there's a large metalhead, conglomerate that brings people to craft beer. And I think that's something that you really, I mean, obviously getting into the Bay Area, which all the stuff that you mentioned before, was it the Bay City Thrashing? I probably butchered that name, but I remember watching sort of short documentaries about that underground music scene blowing up there.
Oh, I mean, it was the overground. I mean, like Metallica is from that. You have bands like Exodus, Testament, Possessed. I mean, even it was huge. Death Angel. But I think that, like, for me, even in Texas, I mean, it transcended even the Bakes. I mean, when I was in Texas, there was, everyone would go up to Three Floyds with their Pumpkinator from St. Arnold's and stand in line, and then there'd be death metal, show going down, and people in line just cracking bottles, having a great time, and being in, like, Munster, Indiana, and getting ready for their allocation of Dark Lord, and it was just like, there's just so much camaraderie. I mean, and I think elements of that existed in beer for as long as, I mean, I've been in craft beer, whether it be the label or, my early introduction to craft beer. Obviously, I mean, I don't know if I've talked about it, but it's Jester King's first tour I ever took, first brewery, first, like, exemplary, idea of what craft beer was to me. And I think, being exposed to that, in like 2008, 2009, traveling down, having my very first tour from, now Washington resident, in Ron Extract. It's just like all this, whether you were a metalhead or not, had a resonant of, like, at least a quirky artistic side of it, but the music has always been part of it. And I remember sitting there listening to metal. They were like, we play metal for our barrel-aged beer. And I was like, this is what I have to do for the rest of my life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You're like, that hits my heart. It hits my soul. Yeah, I will say too, I think it's, for me, metalheads, punkheads, nobody discriminated. It's like it was crazy. Like the whole, like, collective reason that you were there was the things that you want to express inside you, and a love for, like the music and the sound. And nobody, whether you were in the pit or not, there was no discrimination. People were, stoked to have you, and they also didn't allow any disrespect or hate or anything. So I think that was something that I really was like, oh, I can be around these people. And these people didn't look like CEOs or anything like that, but they had the perception and awareness to do those same jobs. I mean, these are some of these people are some of the most understanding and, like, well-spoken, well-thought-out people I've ever met. And then I've met people in corporate environments where it's like, I don't know how you got here with the rhetoric and the way that you, like, hold yourself. But
I think it's the difference between, like, for me, the, like, more blue-collar work.
mm-hmm.
I think, for me, I see that.
Yeah.
More genuine, hands-on, understanding, able to communicate all those things. Yeah. I want to know how you got to Tacoma, Seattle area.
Yeah. Well, we got to go through, because his friends in music led him into some of the jobs he had at Local and Anchor.
Okay.
Or had an influence, let's just say that. Maybe there were people you partied with, but because those two breweries, I think, and then.
Yeah, so amongst all these other things, I worked at Anchor, kind of set up their I got a job there through someone was like, oh, you run a beer garden, which is like where we were working. And they're like, we want to set up a beer garden at Anchor. And at that time, craft breweries didn't have tap rooms. This is all kind of a new thing. Like now it's very common to have a tap room, and God forbid you don't let kids in there. But it was just something that was really unique and new. So Anchor was starting up their very first tap room right outside of the new Giant Stadium, and we kind of set up that pilot system for a lot of R&D and unique beers that Anchor was trying to pump out and trying to branch out of their normal flagships, their namesake, the stuff that was their bread and butter. And working for them, I had a lot of opportunity to do beer education, to sensory stuff with the master brewer, and got to smoke cigars with Fritz, got to party with Chris Robinson, got to party with a lot of other people, got to drink Opatro right at the still, got to work on like barrel age projects, got to brew Christmas ale. I got to do a lot of unique things. I mean, met Ken Grossman a variety of times, got to work on my very first, it's what prompted me to be a level 2 Cicerone, be able to be a part of like judging some of what I only read about in books, as far as like homebrew competitions, so really honed in my own brewing skills.
Did you ever judge?
Yeah, we were able to do, so level 2 Cicerones outside of the BJCP. I mean, there's that BJCP certification, but you were able to also lend a hand in judging. So we would have the annual homebrewers competition that would be held at Anchor. So they'd announce like they do all the judging, and then they announce the winners. It was a big old ordeal. Sierra Nevada would usually bring out their first iteration of the why am I spacing on it? Celebration.
Yeah,
so we'd be able to like drink Celebration for the first time. People would be pounding down old Foghorn barley wines. Be hanging out with like the Maltose Falcons, this homebrew club that you only read about in homebrew books.
The Maltose Falcons?
The Maltose Falcons, yeah, you gotta dive in, dude.
That sounds something out of like Star Fox.
Yeah.
We were just playing Smash Bros. The other night. That sounds like...
Yeah, these are legendary homebrewers.
Okay.
And so like, these are some of like the clubs that a lot of like famous brewers came from. I mean, I know we had brewers that had worked with some of these guys in homebrew clubs before they went to brew at Anchor or some like really prolific breweries at the time. So it was a great opportunity for me to kind of like dive into that facet of that world, and then working at local brewing with Reagan and Sarah and that wonderful team there. I mean, it was just like really beautiful, innovative, like just people that gave a fuck about shit, and we're always trying to innovate and do beers true to style. And that's where we really like, it was like, oh cool, now we're like looking at sensory from a whole other lens. And you go from like a brewery like Anchor that's macro producing beer for the world, and then you go work for a brewery literally called Local Brewing Company that's producing small batch, 8.5 barrel, 10 barrel batches of beer at most, like, to service like the Somo community of San Francisco. And so it was a blast. Had a lot of great time doing that, and got to collaborate with other brewers at places like 21st Amendment, Faction, and we got to work alongside a lot of really phenomenal people. The San Francisco Brewers Guild, and being a part of San Francisco Beer Week was always a blast. And yeah, I got priced out. That's how I ended up in Tacoma. So
just too expensive.
Brewing beer is definitely a labor of love, and selling it is also a labor of love. And I think that, everybody has their price or their sugar mama or sugar daddy to enable it. And it's a lot of sacrifice. So, I was hoping that like I could pursue my dreams of creating a brewery somewhere where I could affordably live. And my best friend lived in Tacoma, and I fell in love with Tacoma. Saw a lot of parallels of Tacoma with Oakland. And I was like, I'm going to move here. I'm going to look at this beautiful mountain every day that it decides to pop its head out.
Yep. When it's not winter time.
When it's not gray.
Yeah. So I'm stoked to talk about Tacoma. I just want to ask really quick, do you feel that the like the beer scene in San Francisco and around where you were working, do you feel that was like more inviting and more inclusive? I say from my experience being up here, whether it's just the cold, rainy season that permits 6 months out of the year, it can be really hard sometimes to get in and make friends or get to know people. I know others can argue me on that, and that's totally fine because other people's experiences are differences. But I know for me, it could be really hard to get to just talking to people in the industry that were similar as you and kind of have them hold the conversation, or the conversation would just go like, "Oh, okay, yeah, you work for so and so. Okay, cool," and then it would just stop. Do you feel like that was very welcoming and very opening, where you were working at in Oakland?
So it's a very sensitive topic, but also one that's unique and probably should be addressed just in terms of the landscape of craft beer. I think that I can't speak to Seattle. I mean, I've worked up in Seattle, and I can tell you that there's elements of that. But I can tell you from at least my observation of the Pacific Northwest, there's a lot more competition up here. Now, there's competition in everything, and I know from like a sales perspective, I come from a time where people used to sell and fight for tap handles at bars, and there was a world where people used to have these beers on tap consistently, and I don't abide by those rules as a bar operator or manager or anyone who's worked on that side of the business, but there's a lot more competition. I think that the Bay Area offered a lot more camaraderie. We were all about elevating each other. I think everybody had an idea and a sense of like how difficult this industry is, and how much you have to pour into it. So I definitely saw that there. And I don't know, I mean, if you ever talk to Dick Hanwell, I would say, ask Dick what he thinks. I mean, Dick left Elysian when they saw and moved to San Francisco and, took over everything that was at Magnolia. Yeah. And I think he still is a very respected individual and always will be. And I think there's like something to be said about someone going to a community like that and being accepted. I mean, obviously your accolades speak for themselves, but I think, the Bay still loves a lot of what he does. And I think like there was camaraderie immediately with him coming out there. But I would say that like coming out here, there is just very identifiable sex within craft beer. And I don't know if it's because it's a smaller community or things have been more challenging. I don't know the deep-seated history of craft beer and its evolution in the Pacific Northwest. But I can tell you that in the Bay Area, there's camaraderie and a lot of uplifting, a lot of community-based things. Collaborations were opportunities to not only obviously market someone's brand, but to also help elevate someone and teach each other techniques, processes, styles. I mean, it was not uncommon to work anywhere where we work where you pick up a phone and you ask someone, hey, how do you do this? How do you nitrogenate a beer? How do you do this transfer?
Right.
Or, hey, I'm working at this pH level. Like I want to bring it here. Like what are some things I can do here? Like I'm looking at it's not uncommon to share score sheets with like beers from GABF and be like, hey, this is what was wrong with my beer. Like let's redo this.
Yeah.
It wasn't uncommon to talk about bad beer and see how to make it better. Out here, I moved to an area where there was a lot of bad beer. That's all I can tell you.
Yeah.
I mean, Tacoma, the reason I saw an opportunity in this place because there was a lot of bad beer. I mean, I could taste it in a lot of things I drank, and I can taste it a lot of the process, and there wasn't that sense of community. I think with the way beer was handled, and I think that translated directly. I talked to a couple people who've been out here for a while about it too, and I was like, this is concerning to me. I was like, here we are in a community, where it's our duty as brewers, at a minimum, to help elevate the palate of the people. I've always said that. If you can talk to someone and educate them on why they're drinking something, and this is regardless of how much it costs or what it is, if you can talk to someone and be able to tell them why, this is a unique beer, and speak to some of the things that might make them interested in the beer, other than, oh yeah, this is a good beer, I like it. I like this beer, it gets me fucked up. I think there's something really special to be said. Right out the gate moving here, I realized that everything was, and it is, we are all in the business of selling beer, but I saw that it was very much a sales-dominated world. Gimmicks, names, things like that were trying to propel the marketing aspect of the beer versus trying to speak to what the content of the beer was.
What the actual product was.
I mean, you got. I mean, I don't want to speak to any of them, but I think it's very common. I mean, I think you drink beers that don't necessarily adhere to any style guidelines that are now moving the market and pushing, and you see things on tap that I was like, why would you drink this when you could drink that? And it was just like, that was a perception of local, and I think everyone's hearts were where they should be, is like drinking locally and supporting your community brewery or breweries or whatever that ends up looking like where you live. But what was lacking was people's understanding of what good beer was. And I think a lot of it that's on the consumer. And then I think a lot of it that was on the breweries themselves was the lack of community and camaraderie. And I think that there was more like everyone thought they were holding like some secret recipe to some golden product that, like, well, first off, nothing here is like outside of like E9's beautiful barrel age program that had been literally puts Tacoma on the map as far as craft beer goes. There was nothing really, people don't know about Tacoma. Like, people just outside of Tacoma, no one knew about it. So that was kind of what was interesting to me. I saw the potential, and then I moved here, and this was back in 2016, mind you. Here we are, 2024. Things have changed vastly.
Yeah.
Some of these breweries aren't around anymore. Most of them aren't. There is a smaller pool of breweries that exists where we've come out of a pandemic. Washington beer in general, I believe, has completely soared to greater heights. I'm very proud of where Washington craft beer has gone in the last 6-7 years. But to speak to like the Tacoma community, it was definitely something that like I saw the community rallied around a lot more of the business aspect of it, and I think that was also something unique that I learned, and I loved it because I mean the craft beer community lent itself to me in many beautiful ways. I mean, I met some of the most dearest and closest people to my heart through that community of people, and I think that's one thing that, like, in a city like San Francisco, you're not going to meet as many genuine individuals as you're going to meet in, say, like an ocean, even though it's 7 by 7 miles.
Yeah.
You're not going to meet that like you do out here, and the people are amazing. But
I will say, I think that the city of Tacoma and its people, they ride or die for each other all the time.
Yeah.
Even if it's for like, and this is not naming any business, but if there was a shitty restaurant, if it's in Tacoma, you will have people support that shitty restaurant until it dies. And because that's just how Tacoma is and how Tacoma grew up. I mean, Tacoma was supposed to be Seattle, and then they found out that they could have a better port up in what is now Seattle, but Tacoma was structured to be like Seattle. So then Tacoma became this very much so kind of industry town where you had the paper mill, you had a lot of blue-collar workers that would come there and drink, and it was just a lot of dive bars and pub grub, and people on Seattle for a long time always shit on Tacoma, being like, oh yeah, you have to stay in Tacoma or you have to go through Tacoma. It was always like the stain, and I think Tacoma did a good job where it took that proudly, and now Tacoma is seen as this, it is diverse and it's fiercely independent. But I think when we're especially talking about craft beer, because we met in 2016 at Seven Seas, I'd been working there for about a year and a half and met you, but that was definitely something, the beer scene in Tacoma. I didn't have the knowledge back then. I think I was just excited about craft beer and willing to try and taste everything, but there wasn't a good standard to a good quality standard to what we were producing. People did certain things well. I remember this was back when peanut butter porters were blowing up. Wingman Brewing did a really good peanut butter porter that it would be on tap at Pint Defiance, and people would drink it down until the keg was kicked. E9's barrel program, sour beers, that wasn't stuff that you experienced a lot. If you did, especially in the Northwest, you had to go to Portland. You had to go to Cascade Bear House and Brewing to get good sour beers, unless you knew about the import selection that you could get at Tacoma Boys, where they would have Creek and other, like, stuff that you couldn't, that was not from the U.S. that really represented those styles. But the Tacoma people live and die for their businesses and for their brands, and so that good strong sense of community is good to have. But there's been a lot of bad beer here for a long time, and it's been cool to see over the years that there has been some law, I feel, brought to it where you made a good point earlier about breweries around here. I know from my experience, everybody felt like they were harboring secrets that you couldn't let the other brewer know. Otherwise, they might take your customer business. I don't think anybody saw it as like, hey, if we all shared knowledge and ideas, was it a rising like a rising tide raises all ships? They never saw it as that. They saw it as like, if I share these ideas and this knowledge, it will take away from my business, which means it could fail. And so I felt there was a cutthroat aspect to it. I remember that being washing kegs, getting stoked to meet brewers and asking them, I'm like, do you guys use a lenticular filter? Like, how many times do you run it through? Like, what do you do? And they were always just kind of like, who are you? Tell them who I worked for, and be like, yeah, I'm just curious. I want to know. And they would just, I don't think they were trying to be rude, but they would laugh. But I think it's part of that mentality where it's like, we're not telling you what we do so you can take it to your brewery and tell them, and then it might make your product better, whatnot. But definitely got shut down plenty of times, newbie in the industry, trying to just learn and figure things out more and trying to talk to these people. But that is where we did meet, which is always fun. I'll let the listeners know. My first time homebrewing was with Chris. That was a good time. I will share this on another episode, but I ended up in the hospital by my own account. Survived the day. We finished the beer, and it turned out pretty good for the circumstances given. But yeah, you started off in the tap room at Seven Seas. I remember they brought in, and they were like, "Hey, we have a new guy coming in from California. His name's Chris. Worked at Anchor Brewing. He's a level 2 Cicerone." And this was right when Seven Seas was starting to allow their servers to take the level 1 Cicerone test, which is very basic. It's like, how do you store kegs? How do you wash glassware? You need to know the difference between a lager and an ale, and like basic general information. But so I was like super stoked. And I remember on the first, you were tending bar, and you'd saw I was reading like my book. We got to talking, my Beer Bible by Jeff Allworth. If you don't have that book, go grab it. It's great. And you asked me a question about where where Oud Bruin comes from, and I was stumbling, trying to flip to the pages and kind of find the answer. And I was telling you kind of what it tastes like, and you just like literally spouted off the page that was in like the Beer Bible of the region it's from, the history behind it, and that's where I knew I was like, okay, I can learn a lot from this guy. But yeah, why don't you talk about your starting at 17?
I just read books, man. That's all I do.
Read books. I like that.
Yeah, no, Seven Seas was great. I was at that time brewing beer in Tin Dog. I wanted to work at a brewery that was smaller. It was a 2-barrel production system. It was literally a small batch using Skagit Valley malt. It was kind of like my dipping my toes into the unique stuff that I really thought was wonderful about Washington, using specialty hops and unique things that just weren't around, and making Belgian beer with it.
Did you ever use whole cone hops? Like when you're at Tin Dog, I feel like
no, we didn't use any whole
gotcha.
cone. Yeah, and I think a lot of these specialty like hops are all pelletized or all experimental or one-off
Gotcha.
stuff. So I was really interested in that. And Tin Dog is they're still around, and it was a wild system. I mean, the guy was all about like allowing beers to ferment at the temperatures in which the yeast thrive. So we got to use a lot of different types of imperial yeast. I got to dive into stuff that, like, coming from a production brewing, I mean, you may use like 2 or 3 different types of yeast, especially back in the day when, I mean, at Anchor, there was like 1 or 2 types of yeast. But then, like, even at local, I mean, it was very rare or seldom that we'd be branching out, doing anything, especially on a cone-to-cone kind of process.
Yeah.
But I was just kind of like, this is an awesome opportunity. They're paying me a livable wage. It was super far from Tacoma, but I was able to brew a lot of really unique things. And at that time, they were also using a Pika test system, and I was fascinated. I'm obviously working in tech. I was fascinated by Pika, and they're, rest in peace, they're no longer exist, but they were a Seattle-based company, allowing brewers and homebrewers alike to have the opportunity to play with ingredients. So it was a huge world of experimentation and seeing like the threshold of yeast and how you can manipulate things on like literally the most farmhouse kind of scale that you can imagine. And he had like the most like quirky brew system that was set up with like a RIMS and electric like heated coils that were all powered through a computer that he engineered himself, and you could set up, you know,
wow, it's like some
mash temps and stuff while you're in the bathroom on your phone. Yeah, it was fun. It was a fun little tiny microbrewery for all intents and purposes. But yeah, I was doing that while I was also at Seven Seas, and I was making my money obviously bartending. So I was able to bartend and supplement a brewer's salary as I got very familiar and always had to do.
Yeah. That's so, like the standard. If you want to make money being a brewer,
live and you don't
work 2 jobs, you bartend and you brew.
You don't have a doctor for a wife or partner, then you probably need to do something else.
Did you have a favorite beer that you brewed there at Tin Dog?
Oh man, there was a dark triple we used to brew, and we used to run it through a grant as we were basically doing our little runoff into. So right after Whirl Off, we'd like run it through this like grant that had a bunch of Mexican piloncillos. If you're not familiar with that, it's just concentrated like sugar cane, and it would give it this like really unique flavor profile. So like instead of using like dark Belgian candied sugar, we'd use that.
Yeah.
And there's always
That's
just unique things. So it was a really cool. I think they still produce that beer. We did a really cool white IPA, which I'm surprised we don't see it a lot of anymore. But I remember Chainbreaker with Deschutes. That was like that was a great summer smasher. Yeah. But yeah, that's not a popular. That's not what the kids are drinking. But we did that, and those 2 beers were kind of fun. I didn't spend a lot of time drinking because I had to. The commute was such a gnarly beast.
Yeah, you had to catch like an hour-and-a-half bus. I'm pretty sure.
Bus or drive and sit in traffic for another 2 hours after a 10.5 brew day. And
I always saw you at the end of my day. You'd be coming into Seven Seas after your brew day. And usually you were there on time, or if you were late, it was like 15, 30 minutes to the bus. And I could tell that you were sweaty and tired, but I was always stoked and eager to talk to you. And I bet you were probably not as eager as to talk to me because now you're like on your second shift. But yeah, always bothering you with questions. I know we definitely, there was a craft beer bar that used to exist, Copper Door, rest in power, Copper Door, but you brewed a beer for them. I believe it was a blood orange, like Belgian Saison. And one, we've talked about this last podcast, but Seven Seas did a good job of getting a lot of people from Texas. And so we also had another friend of ours, we'll bring on one of these days, Mark Montez, worked the bar as well. And he was from, was it Harlingen or McAllen? Similar town.
He's from Los Fresnos, right outside Brownsville.
Oh, okay, gotcha. But you guys had crossed paths and like met before, or were you?
No, we had never crossed paths before. His best friend went to high school with me.
Okay, gotcha.
Yeah.
Was that Andres?
Andres,
okay.
Yes. Rest in power. Yeah, we had very few degrees of separation, a lot of mutual friends and acquaintances, and had never met until we met him.
I see. So we just had a small world of Texas in Seven Seas where people didn't directly know each other, but knew each other.
Yeah, because Chris and I had that too.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And you can share your little bit too, please.
No, he met someone in college that I went to middle school and high school with. Right. We just had a mutual friend. So I wasn't super close with her, but I was close, like her best friends. I was really close with them.
Gotcha.
So her and her sister. So yeah, it was pretty wild when we found out that we knew somebody similar from Texas. So I think everyone from Texas that had met up there at Seven Seas had like that degree 1 or 2 of separation. Like we all knew somebody who knew that person or whatever. So it was really close knit, which was pretty wild because it's a fucking huge state.
Yeah. Texas is massive. Yeah. So then you would come back from brewing, you'd come back to Seven Seas to bartend, and as I worked through production and doing these other things at Seven Seas, Chris obviously utilizing his skills and knowledge. Not only did he did taproom tours, he helped lead the tasting panel and the kind of the QA/QC that Seven Seas set up. He also did a program with the University of Washington, the Tacoma campus, with beer education, beer history, and understanding that better, as well as then they were like, oh, you know how to cellar, you know how to brew. We could use you back here. And Chris actually started Seven Seas barrel program. And when I say started, we had barrels at Seven Seas, and we did random things. But Seven Seas, when I was there, when I started, they'd got wine barrels. I think they had around 50 to 80 of them that they had gotten for super cheap, and we're just maintaining. So we would charcoal blast them, steam them, make sure they were okay. They were definitely throwing stuff in barrels, but at the time that Seven Seas was ramping up and we got that Tacoma facility.
Yeah, you would sulfur them. You'd use like sulfur sticks or whatever was going on.
It was like liquid sulfur. Sorry, I think I said charcoal. Yeah, it was like liquid sulfur. But it wasn't nearly. Chris brought the barrel program to life and made it what it was. And I think that I would like you to, if you're willing to, talk about that, because you did R&D brewing in that, and you both excelled at that for a long time. So maybe if you want to talk about like some of how you got into that, or like some of your favorite projects that you did, we can just go from there.
Yeah. So yeah, I got involved with their barrel age program, and took full responsibility for it. It basically took what was something, I think it started with a imperial stout, like your traditional whiskey barrel aged imperial stout. They'd maybe done a couple other kind of fruited sour beers. They kind of played around a little bit with some inoculation and building some propped up cultures. And so I kind of took that over, developed a program for a few flagships within the barrel age program, but then had a few experimental things. So I think at that point we were doing some rotating imperial stout barrel aged beers. We had been doing a Flanders Red that we ended up doing a few different Grand Cru variants of. So we actually started building a prop system. So we took some kegs and basically turned them into brink, so to speak, and started propping up different cultures. I think we had some different Brett strains that we were working with that we got from Imperial, kind of some experimental things to get started there, and then started working on some PDO. We had some lacto that we implemented in a bunch of different things. I think for a while they were keeping a pretty good track of a lot of different yeast strains that we were bringing in addition to working with some of those cultures. But then we ended up doing some unique kind of blended lambics and some unblended lambics, working with some of those yeast strains and some of those unique cultures as well. So that's kind of the stuff that filled like the initial run of barrels. And as all that ended up growing, and it grew relatively quickly over the course of like about 2 years, we started expanding into some more experimental things.
It did really well. I mean, I remember those bottlings. We had a mobile bottler come in to do the original batch on those. 750, the 750 mils, the small format says 12 ounce, and because we also used that wax that necessarily wasn't wax. It was like this like hardened plastic. It looked great, but it was so gnarly to get off the rip tag when it come off, and you literally had to take a box cutter.
Those were the 500 mils.
Oh, those are the 500 mils.
But then, I think, we ended up like kind of streamlining the whole process, trying to figure a way to make money out of a barrel age program that's just like more than just a passion project. And so these things are difficult to scale when you're dealing with, a 25 barrel brew house, and then you're dealing with another R&D facility that's, in another town. We didn't have tote capability, and then you have an 85,000 square foot, facility that's 3 stories tall, and the cellars. And
do you remember when you'd brew the base wort coming out of the firms, how you'd get it down to the barrel room?
Like 500 feet of hosing transferred down with insane head pressure into.
I would say my favorite time, because I was usually always running the production equipment, and then during the winter time it was just cleaning, inventory, and then it was like, go help Chris, and it literally was a hole just cut through the floor in the top, it's like vinyl threaded hosing. It's like food grade, but went from it could be connected up to whatever fermenter, and then it was literally just wasn't manifolded, no pipe, no. It was like this hose that went down the spiral staircase, into the barrel room.
We're basically like a tiny microbrewery in the size of like a macro brewery that used to pump out all of Heidelberg and some of like what used to be some Carlsberg contract stuff. So yeah, it was definitely
it was funny.
A lot of work.
It was just so funny. When you had flow problems, you'd always check to see somebody might have snagged your CO2 upstairs, or your hose was just kinked, and so you're like, oh, okay, so just gotta flip the hose over. But yeah, we spent a lot of time down in that dungeon, which was fun.
Yeah, and process has improved, I think, over like several years. I think, like, I mean, that transfer hose thing was probably the easiest thing because you had gravity working in your favor, but then getting stuff out of the basement, putting them into
trucks,
brinks or kegs, and then transferring them back in. There was just a lot of beer being moved, so then you have to look at like, you know, the carbonic like impact on the beer, and then there's a lot of stuff. And so I mean, I think like all in all, the project itself just grew pretty rapidly, and then, you know, we were brewing things from like fruited sours to Belgians to doing collaborations with distilleries and taking their barrels. I mean, the project itself, there was an endless sheet of scale of projects, and we started finally getting in tune with the sales team and developing, you know, quarterly releases and planning things out, you know, as best as you could with barrel age projects, and then COVID hit.
And everything slowed down. Those first 4 projects, though, there was a barley wine. I can remember it vividly because this was right after I had this homebrewing accident with Chris. I obviously wasn't able to do my job. I had severed a muscle and tendon in my right arm and damaged a finger on my left hand. So my job was I was just labeling. We bottled these, these 500 ml sour, these barrel projects. And there was a barley wine, and that was kind of like a copper label. There was a brighter label that was a raspberry sour. There's a blackberry sour, and then there was I don't think we called it. Did we call it Grand Cru? I don't think we called it an Oud Bruin, but that was kind of like our Grand Cru style.
I think there was a attempt at a brown or Oud Bruin of some kind. I think that had since we stopped doing that.
Yeah, but those are just like the color of the labels that I remember, and those sold out really well. People were anticipating because usually around Thanksgiving time they had like a barrel aged stout that they would pull out that they had in barrels, and whether there was that in Christmas, and I think they put out a few sours before you came on, but it was very tentative because the main tap room in Gig Harbor. That was where we sold a lot of our core beer at the time when we were transferring to the Tacoma facility in 2016. We were doing around 7,000 barrels out of this super tiny brewery in Gig Harbor. So the barrel program, people were excited, but it was not like the main 4 pusher, which is understandable. So then being in this bigger facility and having more room and wanting to use these literally just like barrels that were sitting there with nothing in them, it went off really, really well. Yeah. So after 7 Seas, you went and started doing other projects, and then COVID happened. You want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So COVID pretty much hit. Production brewery that was the magnitude of serving, for all intents and purposes, like Rainier Stadium and the Mariner Stadium and the Seahawks. We had some placement in some pretty big public venues that kind of brought down a lot of production, and it was kind of some unforeseen territory. Helped 7 Seas with like a rebrand, and at that time was also looking inward, as a lot of us all did, to how to expand and make yourself a little bit more less dispensable, I think, in the beer scene.
A little more versatile.
I think a lot of us, even in the service industry, from like the sense of like, there's a lot of community. I mean, I had this incessant like need to like want to go spend money at people's breweries or their food, and I was like, oh yeah, like, I'm not cooking at all. Everyone's like hoarding all this stuff. I was like, we need to just make sure these people are still around.
These businesses still survive
when we're done here. So that kind of like led me into a lot of other things. Ended up doing sales for meadery, kind of expanding my knowledge on some of that. Wanted to learn a little bit about, some other fermentation type projects. Worked a little closely on some other cider things. Got really into natural wine. When doing sales through the pandemic, it was just a really good opportunity too for me to have like more of like a people kind of role again. So being able to deal with individuals, accounts, bridging that strange like kind of gap between a bunch of people who've been locked up in their homes for months and months.
Yeah, a world of isolation.
And then like, oh, cool. Like, how do we look at a world where we have to go back to something that is supposed to bring people close together and drinking and tasting and my teaching at UW had also come to like a weird place where I think a lot of there was options for doing this tasting of sorts of learning style guidelines and things over Zoom, and it's like, yeah, there's just no world where you're going to learn about off flavors or have some real feedback about a product if you're not in person. And so things were really like kind of strange. I think all of us like navigated it differently. And then for me, it was more cool. How can I get into the community? How can I like, be in a position where, I'm coming out of the 7 Cs, maybe still helping, but then being able to find something that's going to give me some value. And so I saw a lot of value in being able to like maybe help a business come out of COVID. And how are you going to be relevant in the strange world that is COVID, where we're wearing masks and, we have to maintain distance and you can still consume a product and, you're still dealing with people who get loud and boisterous when they're drunk or even tipsy and getting too close or maybe. So it was really strange. And at that time I came across an opportunity in Gig Harbor where 7 Cs is based out of, where I had brewed a lot of the R&D and stuff. We had a local who would frequent the business and some friends of mine who were coming out of COVID as well, who had worked on a consulting project with Hop Farm in Gig Harbor.
What is that?
So they were opening up a craft beer bar, just a bar. These two individuals had a pharmacy, an apothecary of sorts, and they were utilizing a separate space that their architect, who'd worked on a couple different brewing projects and had done all the heritage distilling facilities, was like, hey, you should turn this into a bar. So a couple of my friends got involved with that. They brought me in, basically got this thing off the ground, and were able to open a beer bar basically in the final stages of COVID. So that was really unique, trying to see how to open a bar that was, if they didn't open, and I think you can think of that from like a lot of other perspectives for other businesses. It's like, oh yeah, we plan to open. Now you're telling us we can't for unforeseen amount of time. So,
yeah,
some people have
wasn't promising
different
at all for opening businesses.
Exactly. So some people have different depths in their pocketbooks and their wallets. And so how long can you sustain not opening your business when you've pulled out loans or whatever it is that you've had to do? And so this case in Gig Harbor, these guys were ready to go and everything. They were just waiting for the opportunity. So we opened it in the summer of 2021. And yeah, we battled through COVID. We battled through the fallout of COVID, and now the economic changes and the biggest decline in craft beer that I think we've seen since the boom of craft beer in the late early 2000s. Some different, unique time to be in craft beer, but yeah, I think it's been a really fun ride, being able to like deal with that level of adversity, bring in some really great beer. And one thing that I think does hold true is there's always room for education in beer, and that hop farm facility is a lot of fun because I think there's a lot of beer from all over. So it breaks up the idea of like a traditional bottle shop or beer bar having maybe only Washington beer, or maybe beer that's just in the Pacific Northwest, or maybe it's just beer that's in California and Oregon and Washington. Now we're looking at beers that are coming from Europe, and beers that are coming from the East Coast, and beers that are coming from the South, and beers that are coming from wherever, it's a really unique place, and people come in and have an opportunity to really learn about a lot of different types of beer. But in addition to that, still have their sense of community. And I think Hop Farm brings a lot of like what I like to consider approachability to really unique or
absolutely
wild beers. So it's cool.
It's definitely become like a neighborhood place, and I think along with your passion for like educational learning, you guys do a good job with teaching people. I know you guys have a natural wine program, which is great. It's really typical in a town like Egg Harbor that there's basically the same reds, same whites in every single bar and restaurant that you go to.
Yeah. And there's still that.
Yeah.
I think, we definitely have to, play to our community, and Gig Harbor is a unique place for a lot of, let's say, lack thereof diversity, maybe to some extent. So you play to it, but I think there's always, like, to speak positively of it, there's always a lot of room for, like, eagerness to learn and eagerness to experience different things. And a lot of it is like, hey, did you know that what you're drinking, though appeals to your palate, is actually something more unique and different?
100%.
That brown beer that you have is not, in fact, a brown beer. It's not an American brown. It's a Dunkel, and it's brewed by this phenomenal brewery out of Bavaria. Wow.
Yeah.
So there's like opportunities for like that are like, cool. Like it's just kind of opening your mind to it, and it's brought a really interesting demographic of community together. So I think that's like probably the biggest takeaway from that experience. But yeah, I think in addition to all that, like, COVID also made us all look inwards in other ways. And one of those things was like, I was no longer in that position to just sustain myself on craft beer alone. And so I reevaluated myself and my skill set, and revisited tech. And
I was going to say, because right now you're not in craft beer, but you're in something I think that is just as challenging and passionate. Knowing you like things that challenge you.
Yeah,
keep you engaged.
So I'm in tech and working in facets of software engineering, but yeah, I still get to buy and procure and manage a beer bar, and
you get to have a little dabble, a little taste.
I still have feet in the game, but I have a family, and family needs sustenance and stability. So here we are.
Well, life just changes, and like you said, I think COVID showed a lot of people you have to be agile and versatile. I think a lot of people in this industry realize that craft beer, you can no longer survive on just the free allotment that you get a month and the pay that you get. There has to be something beyond it, and so
we can't survive on low fills and growler fills, dude.
No. Yeah, I think it's awesome. You did a great job on this podcast, and I appreciate your
Gold star.
Yeah, gold star. I appreciate you just like telling and talking about, again, this podcast is aimed at getting people get to know the people that I think really shape and change it. And I think you've done a lot for that in Tacoma. When we have, 200 or 300 episodes where we revisit and talk, and it'll go smoother the next time around. But I think that's something to know, is that you did a good job in, I think, really changing and shaping, the already like multiple scene that was in Tacoma. I think you did a good job with that. A lot of people resonate with you. So do you have anything that you want to share in terms of like projects or things that you're doing, or maybe you just want to, just spout one last thing off before we end this?
Yeah. I think that there's room for one of the beauties of not having a commercially brew all the time is now you like get to have the energy to maybe contribute to some of your own personal projects. So homebrewing is on the horizon, but I think also there's a venue that I get to manage and operate, and I think that there's a lot of really cool community-based type things that we're doing, and so I'm finding ways to not only have amazing beer there, but be able to include like music and have people come in and build a community around music, whether that be vinyl or record collectors, or people coming in to try to perform, or people just trying to listen to something a little different than what
the same old radio station or Spotify playlist that plays.
Yeah, the incessant Creedence Clearwater Revival.
Yeah, Springsteen.
Every bar you go to. But I think even as like a metalhead, I think that there's been some fun opportunities for that, and reaching out to like an audience. And I think that's like what's been the most fun right now is like talking to people from that perspective. It's like, man, I love craft beer, but I love doing all these other things. And it's like, all right, well, great. Like, how are we falling into that? And then I think what's kind of also been most interesting too is just like the non-alcoholic beer game and being able to like tap into that and start to understand, you know, people wanting to entertain ideas of like craft beer through the lens of something that is more than just the effects of the alcohol or what you're consuming, but rather understanding flavor profiles and understanding like the malt involved and like how all these unique things and how, you know, you can understand and have a pleasurable sensory experience with a product that's not going to give you the same.
It's reminding people that what you drink is not just something to get you drunk. It can be something that is inspiring, explorative, creative, all those things.
We're in a revolution, man. It's going to be interesting. It's going to be interesting to see how we all come out of it on the other side.
Right.
For sure.
Well, if you want to check out, so if you're in the Tacoma, Washington area, Gig Harbor is where you go to visit Chris at Hop Farm, the craft beer and tap room, which he manages, runs, and buys beer for. But Chris, again, thank you for coming on, friend. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you guys.
Thank you, Chris.
Yeah.